I think we will get started. It is 11:03, I believe. I am Laurette Dubé, James McGill Chair of Consumer and Lifestyle Psychology at the Desautels Faculty of Management, and the founding chair and scientific director of the McGill Centre for the Convergence of Health and Economics. This webinar is one of three webinars that we host. This one is a collaboration with CMU and Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center on what we call now this Precision Convergence. I will tell you more about both what is Precision Convergence and the series itself, and what is it that we will be doing in the next 2 hours once I get my co-chair, Shawn, to introduce himself. Go ahead, Shawn.
Yeah, thank you, Laurette. Hi, my name is Shawn Brown. I'm the director at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center and also Vice Chancellor for Research Computing at the University of Pittsburgh. And the PSC is a joint research, computational research center between the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University. So thank you all for joining us. Really excited for the presentation and for the commentary.
Thank you. And this series was started a year ago. In fact, June 7 was our first webinar in the wake of the HPC COVID-19 consortium, which was spearheaded by IBM and other of the data and digital company, as well as the network of the research computing, including PSC. And this original consortium was to build a silver lining to COVID-19 to capitalize on both the human capital across organization in a novel way, but also, and most importantly, on all the digital transformation of science and society. So this series is a capacity building webinar series to see to what extent beyond COVID can we bring together the science of the human, science of the machine, to see if we can accelerate solution to real world problem. And clearly, the brain is a core component of the whole person approach that is at the core of this. But it's also about saying to what extent we can cross-fertilize between the various multi-scale mechanisms that are at play both within biology and brain, but also within society, in creating those exposure conditions, as they are called in the social determinants of health, which for the rest of society is everyday's life. And this is within that context that we block 2 hours of your time to be participating in this capacity building, either as keynote, and that the core role that Satra will play today, leveraging brain research infrastructure for scientific culture, education, and infrastructure. But also the panel is carefully selected to bring complementary perspective both to what the keynotes present, but also in advancing all together this precision convergence science. I see Leslie on the panel. This is really building up on more than 10 years and of this brain to society approach to real world behavior. So essentially for the next 2 hours, we will have the Satra in a keynote for about 30 minutes. Then a first round of the panelists presenting each in a 3 to 5 minutes commentary, their build-up of reaction to the keynote, but also introducing their own perspective with the idea of advancing this approach to science and action. And if there are questions in the chat box, my co-chair Shawn will be addressing them as they come up. And we have a last round of commentary where each of you, including keynotes, including us as co-chair, where can we go for this in advancing in the next 6 months or so, the ongoing activity that each one is having. So without further briefing, Shawn, I will shift to you to introduce Satra.
Thank you again, Laurette. I'm extremely excited to introduce both a talented researcher and friend, Dr. Satrajit Ghosh, who is the principal research scientist at the McGill Institute for Brain Research at MIT and an assistant professor of, I'll try this, otolaryngology. Did I get it? As close as it's coming, at the Harvard Medical School. He also directs the Sensible Intelligence Group and is the co-PI of the DANDY project, which is a brain initiative archive for cellular, he is a co-PI of the DANDY project, a brain initiative archive for the cellular neurophysiology. Gosh, I'm butchering this. Anyway, Satra, please take it away so I stop butchering the introduction.
Thank you, Shawn and Laurette. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to kind of kick off this kind of discussion on panel. And I thought of kind of thinking about the work we do as a bootstrapping process towards our panel discussion. And I'm going to hopefully kind of cover some elements of what we are trying to do with brain research and how that impacts scientific culture, education, and infrastructure. But before I get fully started, I do want to acknowledge that what I'm about to present is the culmination of a lot of things by a lot of people and generous funding from NIH and other sources. So I just want to acknowledge that before I get started. Okay, well, one of the things that we are trying to do is trying to figure out ways in which we can measure ourselves and predict our future and adjust ourselves towards some goal-directed behavior. And the idea behind this is that if we can do some of this, we might be able to find elements that are related to particular types of mental health disorders or other medical disorders, and find trajectories of people or pathways over which people overlap. And we want to do this by leveraging the world of digital sensors. As most of you know, almost everything today can serve as a sensor. Even the lack of using something can serve as a sensor. And with the advent and use of smartphones, wearables, and connected devices, together with significant advances in neurotechnology, we now get to a place where it offers us this incredible opportunity to learn more about ourselves through these sensors, but also to be able to understand phenotypic variation in a large population, which may be helpful for understanding different aspects of education, understanding different aspects of health and healthcare and other things. And today we can track individuals longitudinally. And in many ways, we can do this privately and hopefully relate these to data, life, and clinical outcomes, with the potential that we can intervene or nudge these trajectories as necessary. And this is where machine learning and various AI technologies are kind of coming in to perform this closed loop system where we can measure, predict, and adjust things. So this is the background of our group. This is what we are trying to do. We can't cover all of this space, and this involves a lot of different kinds of data. So I'm going to start off our conversation today with this question. What if all data in the world were instantly accessible? And since I want to be careful about all data in the world, I'll simply say scientific or science-related data for now. But we can expand the discussion to all data in our panel or other settings. And I will ask you to think about that question while I go through a few examples of things that we do in our group. So I'm going to cover a couple of examples of translational applications of human communication. We try to understand how we as humans speak, how we listen to speak, and how we use communication. But as we do that, we find that there are ways in which we can use that ability to look at various translational aspects. The second thing I'm going to look at are machine learning technologies for brain science. And this is going to bring in some of the world of open data into the picture. And finally, I'm going to end with the Dandy archive that Shawn was referring to as an infrastructure solution to preserve information and accelerate collaboration for knowledge generation. So I'm hoping these things kind of give us this level of convergence on a couple of different topics that can come together to say, what should our future be like? So let me start with one of the things that most of us do fairly routinely every day. We speak. And it turns out that when we speak, it carries a lot of information that we can use to do all kinds of things. For example, we can use speech to diagnose things like vocal fold paralysis and monitor recovery. We've also shown in some work that we can use it to monitor different levels of Parkinson's disease. And we can understand different groups or categories of people with different severities of Parkinson from the way they are speaking, not necessarily what they're speaking, but way they are speaking. And then we can start looking at some elements of what people are speaking or aspects of it, in this case, something like phoneme duration, and say that we can look at levels of depression based on these things like phoneme duration. And if we are not satisfied with the speech alone, we can kind of transition a little bit into the brain and ask questions as to what components of the brain might be related to depression symptom severity. So overall, speech becomes this incredible sensor that's not just a window into our mind, but allows us to quantify and objectively track people at various levels. But this ability to look at speech has come from the fact that we've been studying speech communication for almost a century in a quantitative sense, and more than that, kind of historically. And more recent efforts now allow us to kind of build this into this kind of complex picture of thinking about speech as well as the brain, and thinking about it as this wonderful output that we have access to, whether on our smartphones, whether as we are talking on Zoom or other things, that we can use to infer things about the state of mind. But our scientific questions are getting increasingly complex as we look at speech. So I'll come back to this complexity in a second. Another thing that we've been doing is, since we are looking at speech, we also look at ways in developing technology for people. And this particular technology is for people who stutter. Stuttering, for those who don't know, involves people producing speech with prolongations, blocks, and repetitions of sound. And for many people who stutter, it may not even be overt. It might be something that's going on in their head. So based on our neuroscientific understanding of stuttering and speech, we've developed an app that helps people. What it does is it takes people's sound, sends it to a phone, we transform it through an algorithm, and send it back with some musically related transformations back into the ear. And when we do this, it helps people who stutter increase their fluency. So here's an example.
Had speech therapy since Harsh, the person I'm working with, is like she specializes in she specializes in stuttering.
And here's what happens when this person puts on the setup.
The Notes app I use all the time, because if I think of something, I'm going to forget it, so just write it down. Or like little things that I see that I want to look into later, I write it down.
So one can easily hear, and I hope all of you heard it, that without this app, this person has fairly moderate to severe stuttering. With the app, this person becomes quite fluent when they're speaking. And so we think of this as a device which has low cognitive load, is inexpensive. It's an app. reduces habituation because we can control these parameters of transformations, is more pleasant relative to other things, and personalizable. So a lot of our work kind of is focused towards kind of thinking about precision medicine and psychiatry as we deal with these different kinds of sensors. So this comes to the first part of that question, which is instant accessibility to data enough? Now, just in these last two examples that I've shown you, some of the work we are doing spans computational neuroscience. It uses neuroimaging and cognitive science. We're looking at psychiatry for depression on one hand, speech language pathology for stuttering on the other hand. It's combining machine learning and signal processing, acoustic phonetics and linguistics. And on top of all of this, we're looking at software engineering and infrastructure to build out these tools and processes. So would data have been sufficient to kind of get at this? What do we need in terms of education of the next generation to span these more increasingly complex questions that we are asking, or relating it to treatments and interventions? How do we train the biomedical workforce? Data alone, I would argue, is not enough. We need more than this. But I'll move on to the next phase of this conversation. I've been talking about brain science. And brain science spans a fairly large space of complexity, everything from subcellular resolution to whole brain scale, just in terms of the kinds of ways in which we can look at information in the brain. But it also spans infrastructure. And today, most of brain science or neuroscience is multi-scale and multi-species. We're developing different kinds of theories, and we want to be able to test these models. We're developing different kinds of experimental designs to get at information from individuals. And we're being driven to do this through biological applications. And they could be clinical, just like the ones I talked about earlier. They could be behavioral, also like the ones like stuttering that we were talking about earlier. But they could be basic science as well. We are missing a lot of knowledge in what we're doing, and everything we probe seems to come up with more questions than answers. To help with brain science, the communities are also building a lot of tools, and this could be instruments like new microscopes, or protocols, new ways to look at an experiment and question things, or analytics. Because data are getting increasingly digital, we need different kinds of tools to work with it. And the data itself has many different kinds of scales. We're spanning everything from kilobytes of data to gigabytes to terabytes of data for kind of simple samples. We're trying to enrich the data with richer descriptors and provenance. And all of this kind of needs the infrastructure for dissemination, search, visualization, and computation. And as the questions become increasingly complex across these multi-scale, multi-species efforts, we need collaboration and coordination. Finally, there is a notion of fairness and efficiency. And for those of you who don't know, FAIR is an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we are using fairness not in the sense of the ML fairness world, but more in the sense of how do you make all of these resources findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So within this space, one of the nice things is that there are many different kind of communities of practice that have spearheaded the generation of open data in neuroimaging and neuroscience more broadly. Over the last 2 decades, access to data sets have grown at an exponential rate. And in turn, this has resulted in more publications that are using existing data. And in fact, it has focused many researchers not to collect their own data, but to think about ways in which they could mine such data or reuse these data to gain new insights about brain science. And this raises new questions on its own. On one hand, everybody should not have to collect data on their own. These open data sets are often richer, capture much more diversity than a local data set, and allow better testing of reproducibility and generalizability. On the other hand, this kind of creates a significant differential in the kind of people who might be able to play with such data sets versus the kind of people who need to collect new data to address new kinds of questions. And these are questions that we don't have answers to as a community, as a society, in terms of should there be data generators and data consumers, or is there a mixture of both kinds of people in the world of science that we see tomorrow? So based on all of this open data, we have access to about 100,000 brain scans across various types of public and private resources. And we can use this to do various kinds of things. But before we get to use it to do science, let's talk about quality of data. One of the things that we have done is we've built some tools with our collaborators that can evaluate quality of existing T1 weighted brain scans. These are brain scans, and given about 100,000 data sets, it's hard to kind of do quality evaluation manually at that scale. So we build these tools to look at data. And here's an example of a data set with quality ratings provided by the data set provider. And so on the columns, on the left column, when I say labeled unusable by source, that means that the data provider said these 2 scans are not usable. On the right, these 2 scans are usable. Our technology over here kind of gives us a sense of uncertainty in these data sets, which is the bottom row that you're seeing. And just by looking at the colors of uncertainty, our technology tells us that the first and third column should be unusable, while the second and fourth column should be usable, which conflicts with the information provided by the data provider. And if we look at these images, these happen to be a case where we can visually see and say that our technology is probably right. Does this mean that the provider is wrong? No, because they looked at quality from the perspective of their processing and said, these data sets pass through our processing, hence we will call it usable or unusable. So the one thing about quality is that it lies in the eyes of the application or the beholder in terms of how we might evaluate these large scales of data. And I'm using MR as an example, but this is going to span every source of data, even if all of that data were instantly accessible. So we took this and applied it to OpenNeuro, which is one of these large databases. And what's shown over here is a set of data sets from OpenNeuro. And this was done about 6 months back. So it reflects the state of OpenNeuro at that point in time. Every data point, which is a vertical line in this case, is one data set, and every point in it is a subject. And what we are showing is this evaluation of our uncertainty metric over the scale of data. Now, as you might see, there's a lot of data at the end which are bad. And when we look at some instances of this, you might get to see that these are partial scans, scans of other species, different kinds of scans, or scans that had different kinds of other pieces on around the head that might affect the quality of the scan. But even on the kind of the end that does have better quality, this mechanism is now able to pull out images which have motion in them or have partial fields of view. And this might not be usable for many applications, but it could also be usable for others. So this provides us a crude way of scaling across a set of data to pull out images that could be used for downstream analysis. But since quality control is in the eyes of the beholder, what we have started is a process by which people can contribute their knowledge into this quality control process. And what we mean by that is we've created a Jupyter book that we launched at the Society for Magnetic Resonance in Medicine this year. And our idea is to use this as a way of collectively including both computable aspects of quality control, but also to basically explore the different ways we can provide assurance around quality as these data sets get larger and available in the public domain. So this brings us to the second end of the second bit of the talk. And the question here is instant accessibility to data enough in the context of these large data sets that are out there right now? So quality was one of the things that we talked about. I mentioned one of the ways in which we can evaluate quality, but this brings us to the more societal notion of how do we evaluate quality in the context of the diversity of applications that people are building on top of such data. And how do we understand which of those pieces of quality could be kind of termed universal versus which of them are very specific to the application? Now, for many of these data sets that are out there, the next question that immediately comes up is metadata and provenance. How much of the data are being encoded with rich enough detail that downstream users can rely on, and downstream users could be computers or humans, in trying to understand how to use this data most appropriately, and where it's leading to bias in downstream algorithms, and how that bias could be avoided. Finally, at these scales of data, we have to talk about both compute and human resources. I mentioned that we cannot go through quality control of 100,000 scans easily, at least in our lab. But is there a social way of doing this once that could help for certain types of applications? And when it comes to compute resources, are we again talking about the rich getting richer, as in only people who can play with these kinds of data are the people who have access to compute resources? Or is there a way to diversify the usability of this data through better creation of derivatives and other things which more people might be able to use with? Finally, it's not data that's just being aggregated. There's a lot of knowledge. We mentioned metadata and provenance, but there's also what people have been doing with this data. And some of the questions that come up is, where is the place to find that knowledge? It becomes almost impossible for us right now to link knowledge and data because publications and data sets don't necessarily connect to each other all the time. There's also knowledge that's being generated that is in people's file drawers that never get out there. So one of the things we want to think about is, how do we get that kind of information out in addition to accessibility to data? And finally, scale. At 100,000 scans, one might think that that's a lot of data. But if you start asking questions like we were doing with depression or other things, where you want to narrow down your focus on a certain subgroup, on a certain disorder, suddenly those data sets become a lot smaller today. What can we do to increase the set of data that would come around? And that's where instant accessibility would be good, but we may not find existing data sets that have all the check boxes that we might need for a question marked. So with this, I move to the last bit of my talk, which is towards the informatics infrastructures that we've been building to help with some of these questions. So I'm going to start with a slide from the NIH Strategic Plan for Data Science. And they started this about a few years back, kind of building out data infrastructure, thinking about the modern data ecosystem, and they're kind of slowly transitioning through this process of getting to data management, analytics, and tools, and then focusing on workforce development through training and other things, and then thinking about the long-term use and sustenance of these resources, which is not just data, it's data, tools, and the ability to do things with it. And this plan is nice. It gives us a broad picture of what at least NIH's vision is. And alongside this plan, they've also instituted a new policy that shared scientific data should be made accessible as soon as possible and no later than the time of associated publication or the end of the award or support period, whichever comes first. Data that do not form the basis of publication produced during the award period should be shared by the end of the award period. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what they mean by scientific data, data management, data sharing, and metadata. Those people can read up later on. But the main thing over here is this provides kind of a little bit of a stick, I would say, to get people to put their data out there. So we may not have instant accessibility, but this will make for more data to be accessible, at least out of a certain segment of the planet that's doing a lot of research in the biomedical space. The other part of this is that gets out data that would have gone into file drawers out of the lab. So people may not have used it, or they may have used it for replication or other things, but somebody's data that was used for something else and not useful to them could be useful to somebody else. And getting this policy out there, which will be official as of January 25th, 2023, cycle of grant application. So it'll still take a couple of years for this policy to truly kick in. But it gives us hope that while we may not have instant accessibility, there will be accessibility to a broad swath of data that's being produced by various scientific labs. Now, this is important because we have a growing diversity of human data. We're not talking of just any of these sensors, but each sensor carries a lot of data alongside it. And some of these are static, once you do whole genome sequencing, except for technology changes, like deeper and deeper reads, you're going to get to kind of getting out the whole genome of an individual. But you might have more epigenetic or other kinds of components that you might want to get out from each individual. Then there are things like imaging modalities like MRI, MEG, EEG, which you could do multiple times, but they're kind of constrained by the amount of time you might put a person in a scanner. Although something like an EEG cap could potentially be worn by a person for a significant amount of time. But then there are these other sources of data like video, audio, wearables, and these can start adding up as well. And then finally, while this may not be the case for a lot of in vivo studies, in some cases, you might get resections of brain tissue for people undergoing surgery for epilepsy or other things, but also in the case of kind of post-mortem scans, which might give us sets of data that are really large. So we have to think about this whole space of human data that's coming from different kinds of things and how we might access and assess this data. And that's a human space. If I move on a little bit to the kind of more animal space of neuroscience, this was a probe called NeuroPixels. This is version 1, and it was developed around or commercially available around 2017. And using this probe, and you could put a couple of them together, you would get about a terabyte of data every 13 hours. Now, today, we might consider that not a whole lot. Well, you don't have to wait much to get more data. NeuroPixels 2.0 will be commercially available this year. It has been in use over, I think, 40 labs at this point in time, and this has already increased the scale of data that these probes are generating. This does not mean anything about the quality of data, how useful it is for scientific exploration. This is simply talking about, as a sensor, am I getting more data out of these probes? And yes, this has increased to a significant, it's an order of magnitude increase. And further on, there's a probe called the NeuroPixels NXT, which is in active development, which, if all goes well, is going to give every grad student or postdoc working on an experiment about 0.5 petabyte of data in a year, or at least that's one of the plans, depending on how it's going to be used. So we are looking at these increasing scales of data, and yet we may not have the ability to deal with where to store it, how to communicate with this, how to do science with this. So towards this effort, one of the things that we've been building is this archive called Dandy, which is one of these Brain Initiative data archives that Shawn mentioned. And this archive has been created as a web application. It sits in the cloud backed by Amazon services, and at this point, also Amazon's public dataset program. We're using standardized descriptors. So this was our way of saying, you can't just put data on the web. That becomes not very useful, because if everybody has to interpret what's in that data, that's going to reduce reuse of these data. So we have adopted a couple of different data standards that are out there: the Neurodata Without Borders for neurophysiology, the Brain Imaging Data Structure, and NIDM for metadata related to brain imaging and other pieces of these data sets. Now, as a web application, you can have multiple collaborators come to this. It's not just the endpoint for publication. You can put data there right as you generate it in standardized format and build all your tools on top of that standardized data, which makes it very easy when you end up publishing these data sets alongside your publications related to the scientific exploration of the data. We've put a Jupyter Hub next to it to make access to the data easier, and being able to essentially have a computer in the cloud that can access these large scales of data relatively quickly instead of everybody having to download it from the cloud. And I'll talk about 2 examples of data sets because they kind of highlight unique elements of this archive. So this is a data set that's being generated by 4 different physical sites. 2 of these sites are in Boston, Mass General Hospital and Boston University. One of them, Lens, is in Florence in Italy, and the other site is Columbia University in New York. And they can all use this archive to collaboratively upload their different components of data that they're generating, because they are generating data off of an ex vivo human brain, which goes through MRI at MGH, then goes over to Boston University to do OCT, and then the slices go off to Italy to go under microscopy, and then the generated data goes to Columbia to do stereology. So this needs integration, and for us, it needed standardization. There wasn't a standard that kind of pulled this together. So I'll talk about that in a second. But at present, this is one of the larger data sets out there in terms of numbers of subjects and the amount of MRI and brain tissue that has gone through these techniques. Another data set that's out there is a single hemisphere of a human brain. And for those of you who are at McGill, the big brain came out of a collaboration between McGill and Jülich and was a single hemisphere. This is like a modern rendition of that big brain. This is using light sheet microscopy to go through and stain different components of the brain. And here's an example of a slab and the corresponding light sheet data, which is at about 2 microns isotropic in various dimensions. But these slabs span the entire hemisphere. And so far, we have about 60% of one hemisphere and some from another sample. And that amounts to about 320 terabytes of data. This is not something that most people are going to download and operate on all the time. And this forced us to really think about what dissemination meant for data and how best we could optimize different things. So to support this, we had to bring a couple of communities together, the brain imaging community and the open microscopy community. Now, BIDS is this data structure or data standard in the brain imaging community that provides a unified representation of diverse modalities of data and related metadata. OME-TIFF and NGFF are things that are being built in the open microscopy community to support petavoxel scales of data, along with metadata that supports descriptors of these things. Mary-Ellen and Julian, who are at University of Montreal, they kind of came together to try and extend BIDS to support microscopy. And they focused on file formats and structures and microscopy-specific metadata that created an extension to the BIDS standard to support such data that we were able to use in our archive to kind of standardize this data. But the development continues because the scales of data that we are seeing in microscopy also continue to grow. And we need to provide ways of accessing these petabytes of data across different kinds of data sets. And NGFF as a new format is pushing the boundaries of this and trying to bring these communities together to help with this process. So as I come to the end of this third part, again, I'll ask the question, is instant accessibility to data enough? Well, we're talking about new technologies over here, new kinds of data that have never been seen. So alongside instant accessibility, we need to be able to make these data available both prospectively for new data sets that are coming online, but also retrospectively for data sets that could be living in people's file drawers. The scale of access and compute has changed drastically. And again, we need to think about how we provide access to this data and compute services on top of this. And this is where communities of practice can really come in and help us standardize some of these elements. So I've seen the world today, at least for this presentation, through this question: what if all the data in the world were instantly accessible? Excuse me. This does not mean that we have answered every piece of this question. There are many questions around privacy, ethics, and other elements that we actually have to think about as we think about the scale of data. I'm going to end with a set of challenges for us to kind of consider as we discuss these things. Curation and education. We are increasingly requiring knowledge of not just the data, but the domain and the processing elements around this. And most current curricula do not span the complexity of questions or data domains, at least in the scientific space. We're also talking about fair standards, formats, and ontologies that can be built to get people to work together and interoperate more and reuse data more. We also need provenance and knowledge that's not just sitting in lab notebooks, but that comes out alongside the data in this digital domain. And this could be how data were collected, but also things related to claims, hypotheses, and other forms of knowledge that we could extract from the individuals involved in creating this data. And finally, at the scales at which data are growing, we need to think about sustainability and governance of these elements. What to keep when we don't know what to keep? How long to keep it? How do we evaluate what to keep in the long term? What does useful data mean? And we have been building infrastructure separately across various places. Could we have an infrastructure commons instead of infrastructure built newly every single time? We understand that the challenges might be to deal with new technologies and instruments and data types, but is there a way to kind of think about infrastructure in this data space, similar to how the World Wide Web provided that initial round of infrastructure to connect pieces in the world. So I'm going to end with saying that fairness is at the forefront of modern science, and we have to use it as an optimization function that helps us think about how we manage these different data, get access to it, and work with it, and ask the questions that we want to ask, which are increasingly becoming complex and multimodal, which requires us to kind of think about education, not just in schools of the technological kind, but also across different disciplines today, as we think about the ethics of doing AI and ML on these data, as we think about commercialization of technologies, as we think about what would it take for translation from data and insight into a clinical or other application. And finally, I think we need a cultural shift that spans all of these spaces, whether it's technological consolidation, training and education, and collaboration. And for those of us in biomedicine, perhaps we can learn a thing or two from folks in other fields. So this is an example of a tweet that just came out a couple of days back of a paper that was published by physicists with 8,778 authors. So I will let you think about instant accessibility and what it means to publish with 8,778 authors, and think about the consequences of what that might mean for the future of science. So with that, I thank you again and look forward to the panel discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Satra, for the clarity of your presentation, but also for the extreme timely significance of this work, because what you are describing there is relevant not only within the brain, within human biology or human health, but as you know, I'm a chaired professor in a business school, and the exposure condition that we have been creating over the last 250 years will not be changed unless we get the rest of the world to change the way we create exposure condition. So if you allow me, I'd like to have one quick question before shifting to the panel, and I will let Shawn also see if he has questions or comments. But for now, my question is a lot of the development in the ability of using those data and computational architecture for neuroscience is tied to the ability of looking at diversity in time scale of operation of the different networks. I would like to hear your thoughts about to what extent this temporal structural organization of the brain could be, or the brain of biology, could be built upon in some methodological manner as we look to the architecture of the environment that we are creating. I don't know if you have some thoughts on this before we shift to the panel.
Oh, there are many folks on the panel who have better thoughts on this than me, but I will simply start with saying, I think we can learn from kind of perhaps evolutionary optimization in a lot of different contexts. And the brain as a network, the structure and the function of it is a network at some level, right? We do need to understand the microbiology, the connectivity and other things, and it's a learning system, which is different from perhaps some elements of society, but at many levels, many aspects of societal interactions are not really very different from thinking about it from a network science perspective. So I'm sure Victor has more thoughts on this that he can talk about, but also folks like Danny Bassett, who's been looking at this intersection of networks as it pertains to different kinds of possibilities. So I think we can learn from either side about ways, and we're still scratching the surface. So I mentioned that single ex vivo structural image is about 320 terabytes. Our spatiotemporal scales are fairly limited right now in thinking about the whole human brain. And we're only scratching the surface of that in something like C. elegans, maybe the mouse to a certain extent. But we are still far short of observing complete dynamics of brain in real time, in vivo, and kind of relating it to behavior. That is a challenge. And I hope that we can kind of use that as our James Webb Space Telescope moment to say, how do we get there?
Absolutely. Shawn, I'll shift to you because I always say to any neuroscientist that I've been talking to over the last 20 years, neuroscience in the wild, what is in the wild for us is not what is outside of the scanner. It is in the real world. And to what extent having this continuity and yet agility and robustness of scientific study of the whole continuum, that's really what you just said, this telescope moment. Shawn, why don't I shift to you? And I think I would be the one introducing Victor. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I don't have any additional comments. Thanks for the wonderful present. I mean, I'll just say that when Laurette brings that up, I then remind her how far we are from being able to do that. So it's great to have people that are thinking long term and ahead to try to get to that point. So thank you. Go ahead, Laurette.
Okay, very good. So I will be introducing Victor. How do I pronounce your name, Victor? Girsa, my big French accent, so apologize for that. But I was in preparing for this webinar, I was looking at one of your paper where you were talking about complex motor, perceptual, and cognitive behavior are composed of smaller units, which are somehow brought in meaningful relationship when we start looking at the hierarchy, the temporal hierarchy, and so on. But when you give the example in the paper, you talk about the bird and the environment bringing the singing bird. And as we know, as we move to advancing the whole brain and then the whole brain in the whole body, in the whole society, we are opening completely long-term next generation research. So I'm extremely pleased to that you were able to make this panel. Let me give you the 30-second introduction. Director of the INSERM Institute of Neuroscience, the system at Aix-Marseille University. He is a theoretical physics, and he is the scientific lead of the brain simulation platform, the Virtual Brain, and lead investigator in the Human Brain projects. Welcome, Victor, and I'm shifting to you.
Thank you, Laurette, for this nice introduction. And actually, Satrajit, thank you very much. Nice for this very masterful talk. Actually, you started your presentation in terms of what if all data were available, and this was then the guiding question, and you unpacked this very beautifully, and going to the various dimensions that it is linked to. If I, however, if you allowed me to play devil's advocate in this context, yeah, if all data were available to us, what would come out of this? If I had to push it, I would say nothing would happen. Yeah, and allow me to unpack this for you. Yeah, you did this to some degree, but from a very data-centered perspective. Yeah, and essentially, interoperability is the term that I would like to emphasize here in this context. And especially talking from the context of the brain, which has a multi-scale architecture, multi-scale actually implies that there are many neurodegeneracies available. Yeah, and neurodegeneracy being the propensity of the brain to generate the identical behavior by using different realizations, or in other words, by using different mechanistic realizations. Yeah? When we do this, when we accept this, and this is a standard challenge we have when we deal what we deal with in neuroscience, it makes it extremely difficult for us to render the problem identifiable, or said in different words, to distinguish between different causal mechanisms giving rise to the same type of behavior. Yeah? That is the consequence thereof is that we cannot just extract the structure that is in the data. In other words, perform statistical inference. What we have to do is causal inference. Yeah? And causal inference requires that we carry causal hypotheses about brain function into the analysis itself. From my perspective as a theoretical physicist, the causal hypothesis is always formulated as a model in terms of a mathematical model. Yeah, and this is essentially the point where I want to go to, that what you need to do when dealing with data in order to make sense out of data and put your finger on the causal mechanisms that you would like to identify. You need to render the data interoperable with models across multiple scales and with methods across multiple scales. And this is actually one of the major challenges that one faces. Yeah? You have addressed these elements in between the lines or a few times explicitly, but it was a very heavy data centered perspective. Coming from the Human Brain Project, which has now led to the infrastructure, the digital neuroscience infrastructure in Europe called the e-brains. Yeah? This is a difficult lesson that we have learned over the past 8-9 years. We have launched the Virtual Brain Project, the neuroinformatics platform for full brain network simulations in 2012. And eBrains has been launched 1 or 2 years ago after 7-8 year effort of Europe to put these things together. And this was one of the biggest, and actually it is still one of the biggest challenges. Open data is happening, will happen, and it remains one of the major challenges. There is no question about this, but they need to be enriched with models and the methods in a common reference framework in which also not only the expert, but actually the community as a whole can operate these elements, data, model, and methods, in order to actually go further than we go as individual laboratories. And it is this element that I wanted to emphasize, that I liked in your presentation, but this element is a little more, even more forward-looking, given the question that you ask. If all data were available today, instantly, what would we gain? Loads of data, but not necessarily loads of knowledge. And for this, actually, we need this aspect of interoperability. These were my 3 to 5 minutes, I guess, eh?
Yeah, very good. You want to reply briefly, Satra, before Shawn introduce the next panelist?
Sure, I will say I agree in this particular case, and I'm not going to play devil's advocate in the context of the requirements of those 3 things. I'll play devil's advocate in the context of education required to play with those 3 things. As we kind of increase the complexity of our questions, what are we going to train our next generation of scientists with when they have access to those things? How can we think about retraining? Because everybody cannot become experts at all of those things. So how do we change education, which has so far focused very much on expertise and driving and getting better at one thing, to having broad acceptance that you may need to know a few things? But I completely agree. Part of, I glossed over it in that section where we designed that stuttering app. The stuttering app is based on a computational model of speech production, a neurocomputational model, which we can realize in the brain. And that's what has driven us in a lot of ways in thinking about speech production. Again, we can't get multi-scale just because, you know, humans speak. We could go to songbirds, but that's a very different element. And there's been some work that's done there. But I do feel like that's what a physicist brings to physics. And that's what also needs to happen in neuroscience or biomedicine, which are models of operation. So I completely agree, I think, with what Victor said. I had a word in one of my slides when I put that question up, and it wasn't in the final version. My answer to it was useless. If all of the data were instantly accessible, to a large extent, useless. And I think that's where we stand right this minute. there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. And this notion of how do we train the next generation, assuming that we will want to continue wanting the cutting edge expert, and we also want to create these commons of data, model, and method. Where do we go from here will be quite important. But for now, Shawn, I believe you're the one introducing Leslie.
Yeah, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Leslie Fellows, who is a professor of neurology and neurosurgery at McGill University and specializes in disorders of cognition. So, Leslie, welcome your 3 to 5 minute commentary.
Thank you. It's been a super interesting discussion so far. Thanks a lot for the overall presentation, which was absolutely on track from my point of view. So I think of myself as a cognitive neuroscientist working in healthy people, but also people with brain health conditions of various kinds, neurology, obviously, but psychiatry, psychology, and just general medicine. So kind of from that point of view, I guess I wanted to add some players to the sort of ecosystem that you sketched out. One is the human being who's participating in the research. And I think there's a bunch of factors around that have been interesting to us as we've been trying to figure out how to kind of scale up what we do with the vision of, you know, every patient, a research participant, or you know, how to try to develop generalizable samples, drawing on all kinds of different people. And to me, the first thing is that the person needs to be at the center of the research, the participant. And for them to do that actually is a bit of a paradigm shift in medicine, I would say, maybe especially in neurology and psychiatry, but I think in general, there's sort of a tension around the idea of the person as a kind of something to be studied, you know, put it on the petri dish and have a look at them, versus kind of a partner in the enterprise. It's a certain suspicion about what the person has to say about their situation that's maybe especially enhanced in brain disorders. I would say just kind of socio-cultural perspective within these fields where, yes, you're interested in what the patient's experiencing, but you also want to know from other people, you know, there's sort of an unreliable narrator sometimes. In some conditions like Alzheimer's disease, you know, they're totally unreliable compared to other sources of information, which I think tends to bias the field away from asking people how they're doing. But outside of some extreme situations like psychosis and perhaps, you know, Alzheimer's, dementia, I think generally speaking, the participants of the people do know how they're doing, and it's really important to ask them. And that actually turns out to be quite difficult to do well. If anything, the patient or person reported outcomes are not particularly well done to the extent that they've been worked out, like the NIH has worked on some of this with PROMIS and some other things. They haven't necessarily been thought through for people with brain disorders. And they're not that useful in Canada where we have issues of translation and so on. So there's quite a bit of sophistication actually around measuring people's subjective experience of their conditions or their circumstances that could be cleaned up, where there are tools to do this. We just need to implement them more systematically. And that would speak to Laurette's desire to study people in the wild, but at least study people on their own terms and with them rather than, you know, of them. So we've been trying to work on this at McGill with the Brain Health Outcomes Platform, or BHOP, and it's been quite an interesting experience to try to integrate a high quality person-centered outcome platform where the person directly enters their data into the web. You kind of skip over all the traditional interactions with people in the clinic. In order for people to want to do that, I think we need to give them something back right away. And our kind of model would be to return the data to them in a way they can use immediately, like a dashboard or a personalized longitudinal sort of you know, digest of how they're doing on parameters that interest them. And then also perhaps interest their physicians or other clinicians in order to sort of help build it into the clinic. And that's been a pretty uphill battle in our context. Across McGill hospitals and so on, there's very little common electronic medical record, totally not suited to this kind of thing. We've had to develop it in parallel. And the uptake of it has been slow for lots of reasons. But I think it's vital for, certainly for clinical research, but probably just more generally for whole human being research. So I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that. Even things like a universal ID or a common ID for participants remains elusive, even at the MNI, which is committed to the Open Science Initiative and is trying to get even there, the coordination across what's a relatively small hospital really remains challenging. The other thing I wanted to mention about person-centered stuff is I was interested by your UPDRS example in an early slide. You know, the legacy measures that we typically use as our validation for novel approaches are mostly kind of crappy. I guess I would encourage the field to jump over some of those legacy measures if they're demonstrably poor and may or may not reflect patient priorities or even be very good measures to get to things that matter to people in the real world, which we may have a better handle on with more modern information. And then the other sort of, I guess, party that I think should be part of the ecosystem is the research ethics community and the institutions that host those research ethics boards. We have had a lot of challenge locally trying to get research ethics on board with any of this. I'd be interested to hear others' experience if that's idiosyncratic or not, but open science and human beings with brain disorders, the ethics boards are having seizures over this. Even things like the consent process, directly doing that online, just, you know, quizzing people to make sure they understand with a little online quiz, which is actually a higher standard than we hold people to in the face-to-face consent, the traditional kind, where no one usually bothers to ask the patient if they actually understood what they read, as long as they sign the sheet, which is usually 8 pages of legalese that nobody reads. So I think that element, at least on our side, remains really challenging to end up with an ecosystem that would have humans participating in research in a way that's going to give them something back right away, and have ethics boards have a framework that will let us do this. It doesn't take years to get approvals for things. Just getting an approval to give people back the information that they just told us was challenging, to give you a feel for things. So I guess maybe those are my comments. Maybe the last point, just in response to the discussion we just had, is that to me, most of what we're talking about is observational data, very rich, very interesting challenge to try to put it together. But if you want to look at causality, at least in my field, you need to do experiments. And I don't know, you know, that gets tricky on large scales, and the coordination of that. So I guess the secondhand thing is to be able to look at the effects of interventions or natural experiments longitudinally, which is pretty high use data from my point of view, and amongst the harder things I think for the big data fields to really pull together. So I hope we're moving in that direction, because that's potentially really valuable.
Leslie, before moving to Satra's comment, hearing your thoughts of next generation training could be very relevant you currently are Vice Dean of Academics at McGill at the medical school. So what are your thoughts on the discussion we're having on training expert vs training convergence scientists that remain expert in some way? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think students and trainees are kind of ahead of the game. They're quite open to this kind of thinking, and usually more nimble on working with existing data sets and so on. I agree we could be doing a better job of baking that into the training. Like there's kind of a tension between kind of teaching the traditional approaches, at least in my field, and saying, oh, never mind, just go look in the UK Biobank and see what you got. So, I mean, it's a moving target, this stuff. I don't think you can expect to train people in all areas. Maybe to me, the thing that maybe is most important to train these days is a facility in interdisciplinary collaboration. I don't think we do a good job of training that, of helping people understand the steps to effectively collaborate with someone, even in a near field, never mind something quite distant. That's an area that I'm interested in working on, is how to train people to collaborate, because I don't think individuals are likely to be able to be, in their training at least, that versatile. It's hard to know even where to direct them, depending on where their career is going to evolve. But if they learn how to work well in teams and how to collaborate effectively, and then that'll do it. 8,779 people later, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Let's shift back to you, Satra, to hear your comments before Shawn introduces the next panelist.
Very quickly, I'll just kind of connect the first thing that you talked about, which is kind of the participant-centered participation. So Open Humans is a community out there that has tried to kind of bring this model into play. It's hard. And people have used the Open Humans platform. I think Cluster Headache, so Nobism, is a community that came together on top of the Open Humans platform to try and understand themselves together. And then there is the Open APS, which is the community of diabetes that came together to kind of both engineer systems to come together. So I think it's possible. It's just that, again, it's very counterculture to the nature of some of these things. But I think communities there are ready to participate in kind of thinking about their disorder. So I really feel like it's more about perhaps the scientific and medical culture of how we publish and do science, as opposed to the possibility not existing of working with the communities to do things. And that brings me to the kind of relates to the last part, which is on ethics and IRB. I think if communities participate, it takes away a lot of those challenges from the perspective of IRB. And if we can kind of combine those two elements, and this is what the Open Humans community tried to do a little bit of, there might be a possibility that we might get to the stage where it's personal data in their personal data store. They decide who has access to, they decide when people have access to. And I think the technology is already there. It's not like we need relatively new technology. Many of those pieces, if you had a team and sufficient resources, we could put a team together to enact that technology at scale fairly quickly. So that's, I think, less of a challenge today than it used to be, but it's more, again, about communities and the social dynamics of interaction on top of the technologies that I think we need to kind of think about.
Shawn?
Great. So it's, again, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Phil Blood, who is the scientific director at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center and the PI of a couple NIH Common Data Fund ecosystem projects, HubMap, which is the Human Biomolecular Atlas project, and SEDNet, which is a data repository focused on cellular synesis. And we should all congratulate him because his daughter is getting married this week. So,
oh boy,
congratulations, Phil.
Shawn always makes things so personal. He's great that way.
A quick comment, Phil. In addition to congratulating on the mother getting, on the daughter getting married, we had Jonathan Silverstein on our as a keynote sometime earlier in the year, and he was briefing on this moving from open science to secure data liquidity. But all the work that you do with him is about the body and the disease, and the brain is within the body and the disease. So as you make your commentary, why don't you have this in mind to kind of the discussion today is zooming on the brain, but the first interface before the society is with the body. So shifting to you, Phil.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shawn and Laurette, for inviting me to participate. And Satra for the really great talk, really hitting on all these things that are very near and dear to my heart right now and capturing my focus. And I hope to kind of selfishly leverage this discussion to maybe get some insights that will help with this all-consuming thing that Shawn and Laurette just mentioned that I'm engaged in with the Human Biomolecular Atlas program, which is, for those who may have not heard about it, it's the modest goal is to create cellular resolution 3D reference map of the entire body, minus the brain. So everything, we've got everything else except the brain. And so, these are very key things. And, I think your talk really highlighted and touched on, the real major challenges that we are facing are social technical challenges. And so I was, I wanted to maybe just talk about and maybe get some additional insight from you on some of the social aspects that you've run into as you've tried to integrate data, improve data quality, improve data standards. These are all things that we're very much focused on in HubMap. I think right now we're up to 27 different modalities that we're trying to integrate across, I don't know how many organs we have represented right now. I think, 15 different organs, and obviously we're constantly trying to get more and more. We're constantly trying to get the latest cutting edge modalities to get at cellular and subcellular resolution of what's actually happening in these cells and in these various different tissues and functional tissue units and anatomical structures within the various organs, and somehow create a reference for this that we could call like a normal reference. But we're doing this across donors of all different ages and sex and backgrounds, and so how do we get a handle on what is normal variation here with this great complexity of things? So the points you touched on were really, I think, central to this. And you talked about just understanding data quality, for starters, and how to do this. And you talked about being able to bring data into common standards. And I wondered if you could just maybe comment a little bit more on any of your experiences with how to engage people to take on this work. What have you seen? What has motivated people to want to engage and work to improve the quality of the data in the community? Because one thing that's very clear in HubMap is that this program is not going to be, it's going to be a starting point for this big 3D reference atlas. And we won't even be able to really get to the starting point without bringing in all kinds of different data from the community. We hope to create sort of gold standard data in some way that's really targeted at this, but we're going to have to be able to integrate a lot more data to even start to address what's normal. So I'm really interested to hear in terms of engaging community, any things that you've seen that are really effective in bringing people together to motivate people to what's the benefit and the, I guess, the return on their investment in improving metadata or data quality in developing or coming together to develop new standards and put data in that context. So that's one thing. I want to pause here and give you, if you have a thought on that, and then I've got more, but I might save those for later.
I'll make a quick comment. The analogy that comes to my mind is curling. So science is almost like that block that's moving and it wants everything to get out of the way. That's what scientists and researchers are looking at. It's like, let me do my thing. Don't get in my way. And if we say standardization, it's like a block in front of it, and they'll take a broom and move it out of the way for most part if possible. Yeah. And sometimes it helps, I think, with NIH and other places putting a little bit of stick into it. But that's should not be the right way to approach it. I don't think so. I think the question is, what can scientists get out of doing that standardization? And one of the examples I'll give is the brain imaging data structure, which has been fairly successful in the community of saying, it's not for sharing, it's for you. If you standardize it, it makes it useful for your future grad students and postdocs to use this data. You can use tools developed by the community to process this data. And that kind of acts as an internal incentive. And I think the more we can kind of think about what can be kind of dual facing incentives, where you also do the outside bit about standardization and can help, and also the inside part of getting some of these things. I think part of the challenge is we bend over backwards around innovation in most grant applications and other things. And that keeps us at this kind of edge of it always has to be something new. And these things are not so much about something new, but something stable. And there's a conflict that inherently lies there. And so part of the challenge here is really kind of thinking about how do you reduce that distance? I don't think we can obliterate that distance tomorrow, but how can you do things in a way where you can keep doing new things, but while paying attention to your rear view mirror that says, okay, it's not just a publication and I'm done with this data set, but there are other things that I may not have thought of that could be useful to others. And that is the cultural change, which is going to take some time, which is where I would kind of come back to the LHC and that 8,778 person paper of saying, there is a community we can learn from, which has been doing some of this for a while. But I think the incentive structures are quite different in the two fields.
Right, and that was what I was, as you were speaking, I was wondering. Shawn did point me to this BIDS thing a while back, and I wonder, and maybe other folks can comment here, either briefly now or as we discussed, how much sort of the process for creating that, and also maybe the product itself could be generalized to other to other efforts, like all these other things we're trying to do in HubMap, all the other organs. So I don't know if you have initial comment on that or others here on how either the process of that or the actual product could maybe.
I'll make a quick pointer. So there is a project called Spark, SPARC, which in some ways is like HubMap in the sense that they're trying to look at spinal cord related things across various different modalities. And they've done a fair bit of effort in trying to make things BIDS-like. And you might want to look at some of the work they have done. And I don't, the other point I will make is we think of things as being the right thing and don't think about the evolution of it. And so I would challenge us to say BIDS may be the appropriate thing to try and emulate, but keep the possibility of extending depending on the needs of your community. I think many people try to say, I'm going to shoehorn everything into BIDS at times. And that's not what BIDS is about. BIDS is about making something useful, which means working with the community to make sure tools and other things also kind of interact with that standard. And if you put something into BIDS and no tools exist, that's not going to bring that community that's developing tools into the picture. So I say this is a very resource intensive process. So I think that's on the process side, that's where it requires a set of people to come together, spend the time. BIDS wasn't born in a day. In fact, I would say the history of BIDS probably goes back about 11 years at this point in time.
Thanks for those comments. Sorry, go ahead.
If I may, before we continue the panel, I need to ask you two this following question. Because we talk about HubMap, but Jonathan and team has also recently the SendNet network that is about aging and so on. So this notion of considering the body without the brain, for me, is absolutely, as we get older, the disease are not independent of how the brain works. So how could we move forward in more integration because the brain is not just the place where Alzheimer's develops, it's what we make decisions with from the time we are born. So this aspects, this question, how to integrate all those architecture and research on body and brain, but the other aspect, which is also key, is the two-way interaction between the research and the clinical. Because if I remember Jonathan's briefing, it was a lot working with clinical data. Leslie worked here with clinical data. So I think that this notion of reciprocal interface between the research and the clinical are also very important. So 2 points where I would like to have your respective commentary, how to place the brain somewhere within the body, but then also how to build more reciprocal interface between the clinical and the research. So Phil, you want to start on that, and then I want to hear you, Satra.
Sure. So I agree. I think there's a very practical matter of being overwhelmed with a particular set of things, and just it's very resource intensive, as Satra said, all of these activities. But I think it starts with building these connections between the communities, and I mean it is. We have several already overlapping connections with the brain community, and this is another great overlap here. And so I think we have to build there. We recently gave a presentation to the BICCN on HubMap infrastructure and some of the tools that we're creating there that might be useful for the community. So I think we can find some common ground, and like Satra said, some things that go both two ways to start to build those connections, and then hopefully build that out into more substantive ways that we can connect the information and the knowledge that we're generating in the various projects, so that we have this complete reference, or we have common tools or ways to analyze and process the data, so we can get insight across the various organ systems in the body. And then on the clinical and experimental side, I would have to say, so Jonathan does a lot of work on the clinical side. I would say that right now in HubMap, that since we're working with deceased donors pretty much exclusively, not completely, there's less of that emphasis right now, and there will, I think, be more emphasis on that in SendNet, although that's still sort of getting spun up, and so I think that's still very much an open question in my mind, and not a lot of traction there yet, but something certainly that I think could be worthwhile to think about going forward.
Thank you. Satra, your quick comment, and then I will let Shawn introduce Celia.
Just on the front of the brain and HubMap connection, as Phil mentioned, BICCN is one of the places, but there's also another consortium called PsycEncode, which is also doing kind of transcriptomic work in that space in relation to psychiatric and other disorders. So there is some work, and then not to bring in the CZI into the picture as well, which is related to the HubMap, the Human Cell Atlas program. So there are a couple of things that are connecting, and I really think it's a matter of partition that happens with communities right now. But part of the challenge, I think this is where infrastructure could play a role in bringing two different communities together into the same platform, even if they're looking at the platform through the lens of their communities. And that might be something, Phil, that I would love to talk to you about PSC and some of the things that we are doing in Dandy, kind of just moving forward. And the second piece, the clinical part, there are a few efforts in the NIH right now, which is around AI and ML and clinical data. So AIM is a program in the US, which is trying to bring machine learning people with EHR and other pieces together. And then there's the All of Us initiative that's been kind of trying to get at this. I think part of the challenge here is EHR data is complex, and there are multiple commercial entities out there trying to just do data wrangling around this space. And I think that's part of the challenge, which is in the research space, we can do certain things, but really the true scale of this is all the case studies and all the hospital, the actual workflows of clinical workflows that could be brought to bear on questions. And I'll just put it that that's something would be wonderful to aim towards and how we can do that. But that's, I think, the challenge that we feel exists right now.
Thank you. Shifting back to you, Shawn.
Yeah, we can't, we could just put it all in Mink, right? That'll solve it, right? I had to do it. I had to say it. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Celia Greenwood, who is a James McGill professor at McGill University and also the director at the Ludmer Center for Neuroinformatics and Mental Health, which I got the extreme pleasure of working with her in both of those instances. So please, Celia, we look forward to your commentary.
Very much. That was a really interesting and fascinating presentation, Satra, and I'm really enjoying the discussion and listening to it as it goes along. The comments on education have come up already a couple of times, but I'm going to go back there again because we've talked quite, I think, a little bit about how do we train researchers to work in this space. And perhaps we haven't talked very much about how we train the rest of the world to understand what's coming out of this space, because we have to not only train the researchers who will be working with all this data, but also everybody else on how to understand it and work with it and move forward. And I think as researchers, we're a little bit inherently open to changing our minds, right? To saying, oh, actually what I believed before or what I understood before, it has now been shown that has, there's a new interpretation, there's a new nuance. But that particular openness to changing one's mind or changing one's opinion or changing one's understanding is perhaps a little bit less common outside the academic milieu. So how do we do that? How do we tell people that a simple association may not be a simple association? How do we bring people to understand the biases that are inherent in data and that understanding can change? And I'm going to link that comment to the comments on BIDS, actually. BIDS as a data standard, and maybe that's going to be limiting in the future. If I want to draw a parallel with a different domain, if we take the human reference genome, we worked for a long time with the human reference genome and got a lot of really interesting results out of it. It was, it is still a standard that is extensively used, but it's very European centric. And it doesn't capture all of the complexity of the human genome because it's really almost just one person's reference. And so now we have a graph reference genome. And that changes all kinds of things about how you interpret your data with reference to some kind of standard. So I can see that the same thing could easily happen, where the BIDS will be replaced by something that's more complex. How do we not only introduce ourselves to that, keep ourselves up to date, and how do we introduce the rest of the world to staying up to date with these kinds of changes? So I think the whole question of education is really challenging. And I want to go from that point into the question about how do we know when we have enough information and when we don't. So if we take the UK Biobank, we have 500,000 people measured with genetics and phenotypes, a large number of brain scans, which is going up rapidly. And that is a really great resource, but it's very focused on one country. So how do we know when we don't have enough? The causal angle has also been raised by a number of the panelists, including yourself, of course. That requires a lot more infrastructure to collect and to keep, to make sure we don't have so much loss to follow-up, to interpret in the context of changing environments and social lifestyles, and just what's going on in the world around. Side where we don't have enough to interpret something in its proper context and in its proper environment. I hope my internet connection is stable. I hope you didn't lose me too much there. So we've talked a little, there's some really exciting simulation work being done, simulating data from scratch, simulating on a microscopic scale with the virtual brain, or starting with a data set and simulating on top of that. If you start from scratch, you can control everything. If you start with an existing data set and simulate on top of it, you're hoping to incorporate more reality. But is that a useful tool? And how can we know when our simulation is accurate, when our simulation is inaccurate, or whether it's too limited because it's limited by our own contexts and opinions? So I will stop there and listen to some thoughts from you.
I'll start on that back end of simulations. So Roger Baxter, I think, said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's what we need to kind of think about. Models are still very, very useful in constraining our knowledge into something that reflects our understanding of the state of the system at that point. And that's the thing that we want to keep improving, because that'll help us with those causal inferences or hypotheses that we might want to make. But we tend to starve models to be too unrealistic, I think, from reality at times. And that challenge sometimes, I think, comes from the fact that we don't have observational things. And then it's like, you know, dreaming of what could be in the model as opposed to observational things that could inform the model. So it has to play that dual role of, which is why I think the data side is as important as the model. The model has to tell us where there are gaps in data and what we need to kind of enrich that space of things. Now, the gap part brings us to the first part of your things, bias. When do we know there's enough information? My answer to when do we know there's enough information, I don't know the answer to that. I think there are cases where we might have, you know, the world of validation, right? All the validity work has various procedures that we can follow to kind of tell us whether a particular model or a finding is valid. And I think we can use those elements to help us understand if we have enough information. But I think part of the challenge here is really when it comes to the kinds of models that we are using. So I'm using the word model fairly generally over here at this point in time. It could be a computational model like the ones that are in TVB. It could be AI and ML models, which might be very different roles or relationships to those things. And it could be something as simple as statistical models. I'll strike the word simple from it.
Thank you.
That, again, model make different kinds of assumptions about our understanding of the world around us. So I think what we're really saying are these models capture our understanding of the world around us. We make assumptions when we make these models. We should highlight those assumptions to the extent we know them. And then maybe the data can help us answer which of those assumptions were appropriate or not as we do it. I think bias is one thing that is quite high in the world of AI and ML right this minute. And that's guiding a lot of work and thinking about the process. But there is no magic bullet towards that. I think generative modeling is providing a way of thinking about bias. How do we kind of think about the space? An example I'll give is there's a neural network model for brain segmentation, where pretty much the entire data to train that model is generated synthetically. And it does not reflect some of the data that's generated. You would never look at it and say, that's a brain under an MR machine somewhere. Because now the assumptions of the model are, the model wants variation. I can generate variation with synthesis, and I can explore that space of variation much more rigorously than the natural world allows. So we also have to think about kind of bias in the sense of what's in the natural world in a certain context, which is what we are getting in existing kind of human data sets, but also the bias that we might create in synthetic generative processes because of the assumptions we are building into some of those things. And I don't have a good answer, Celia, but I think it's something that we have to keep paying attention to as we explore this world.
So we have to go back to the issue of generalizability and validation, absolutely. And the comments on, you know, causal modeling that were made earlier are also very important. They may point the way to what's going to happen, but you're going to have to actually try it out or do the intervention or do the longitudinal study and actually see whether it holds true and where and when it holds true.
And before introducing Andrew, the last panelist, I need to ask you a specific question, considering the fact that, Celia, you are very much, we're talking about the human genome. That was kind of a key building block in all this omics era. But the genes is also kind of the roadmap upon which brain, biology, and society evolved. And to what extent you made the comment about the actual in database being primarily Western-centric. You are involved both internationally in advancing genomics database, brain database, and so on. Where can we go for democratizing and decolonizing, let's say, the understanding of we can extract from the current omics or brain and other life science database? Just a quick insights on this, because that's an important piece.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much happening, of course, in many different research labs and institutions around the world. There are a number of modeling attempts with varying degrees of success. But the other thing straightforward thing that has to happen is to improve the data. That comes from different populations, different ancestries, and different parts of the world. That's a question of investment and infrastructure that just has to be done, because the attempts to do transfer learning or that kind of thing, although there's a success in some cases, there is not success in all cases, and it cannot be treated as a solution. The investment in data has to happen, and then that also brings in, of course, all of the other things that we have been discussing here around how do you use the data responsibly, store it safely, etc.
So, Satra, anything to add about the kind of getting a more worldwide view of the biology from gene to brain? Satra, and then I will introduce Andrew.
So Shawn has his hand up.
Okay,
I will
Shawn,
just briefly say that in terms of the worldwide view, at least on the brain side, and I think the Human Cell Atlas and the HubMap is doing it on the rest of the body side, all these brain initiatives that are around the world, including the Human Brain Project in Europe, there's one in Japan, there's one in Australia, there's one in China, that's kind of bringing together some of this. I think the challenges now become geopolitical a little bit. So there's GDPR in Europe. If you're collecting data in India, it has a similar thing where it cannot leave the geographical boundaries. Define how, I don't know exactly, but I presume the data center has to reside within the boundaries of India. So I think those are some of the challenges that one has to think about in how, but maybe it'll force us to collaborate more as a result. So I don't know the right answer to this, but there is a lot of effort right now in trying to bring diversity into these data banks.
Thank you. Shawn, did you want to add something before I introduce Andrew?
Yeah, I just have whenever somebody does, since I worked in epidemic modeling for a long time, which is way more approximate than most of the stuff you guys are doing. Whenever anybody does that, all models are wrong quotes, I like to correct it. I would say that all models are approximate. Some have better approximations than others. So
thanks.
I'll turn it back to you, Laurette.
Thank you. So Andrew, I'm very, very pleased to introduce you as the unique colleague from a business school. Andrew is assistant professor of information system at the business school of University of Victoria, but he is also in his earlier life, he had creating some of those digital health tools and to be used in precision medicine or others. And the perspective that he will bring, I think, is extremely important about the link between the open, publicly funded, philanthropy funded or private funded. So Andrew, why don't I keep the time for you to comment? Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Laurette, and thank you very much for the presentation, Satra. I think what really hit home for me is actually seeing a functional demo of the mumble melody. And I know that's just a small segment of the work that you've done, but when I was kind of preparing for this presentation and looking at this slide, at your slides, when I hit that slide, I said, okay, there's kind of potentially immediate functional value in a lot of the array of work that you're doing. So what I'll do as far as my comments go, I'll sort of bucket them into three main categories. The first we've touched on a lot, so I'll keep it brief, and that's related to the data federation and the standards that we're all striving for. But what I wanted to focus most of my comments are on are the sharing incentives of data in the research domain, and also once some of these products or services potentially become commercialized. And then third, I wanted to touch on, Satra, where you see the money-making machine going with the work that you're doing at the end of the day. So that's obviously, I have a downstream perspective on some of these things, and there's a lot of regulatory issues that we just touched on before that need to be overcome before these can become commercialized products. And some would argue that it's only after commercialization that you actually see the biggest benefit for the largest number of people. I know that's not always true in all cases, but I think it might be interesting for us to quickly touch on today. So starting with the data federation and kind of creating unique data standards, the discussion that we're having today is, I don't think, unique to this domain. Anything related to health is sort of has the opportunity, but also is suffering from the same issues. I did a lot of work with the BC Center for Disease, BC Center for Disease, and it's the equivalent of the CDC in British Columbia. And what we were trying to do is come up with some sort of federated data standard or some type of ontology for infectious disease. And that was obviously accelerated by the needs of the pandemic that arose from the pandemic. But another kind of major silo within the Center for Disease Control is that they're trying to come up with a food ontology. So things related to foodborne illnesses. And the first thing we did was we looked at all these databases that were available. So Satra, you have that one slide that I'm not completely familiar with all these databases, but you list out BOSDB, NEMO, the brain imaging library, and infectious disease and food ontology have equivalent databases. And the first thing we tried for over a year was to kind of put our programming chops together and programmatically unify these databases. And as you've probably seen, there's lots of challenges in being able to do that. So we've kind of pivoted completely. And actually, Damien Dooley, who was here earlier in the presentation, he's not here now. We're taking the opposite approach now. He's actually building an ontology for foodborne illnesses from scratch. And now he's trying to convince various organizations to adopt that ontology. And that's sort of the approach that FHIR has taken as well, I think, rather than try to kind of be clever and use AI algorithms to try and unify this data. Why not just create a new standard and encourage people to use it instead? So I'm not sure if maybe that's where you see this area going, but maybe we can touch on that just after my next comment related to sharing incentives. So I really like this slide that you have talking about the various databases that are available, Satra, and you actually write in the notes here, on one hand, everybody should not have to collect their own data. On the other hand, this may cause a significant differential in effort between researchers who still need to collect it and those who benefit it as well from it as well. And Laurette knows this inside and out, but in the open innovation literature in business schools, this is a primary misalignment of incentives that is constantly trying to get resolved across lots of different industries. And on one hand, from a researcher and an idealistic perspective, I'd love to see lots and lots of academics freely sharing their data. But what ends up happening is that those academics who have aspirations to actually turn these ideas into companies, they find that whenever they can kind of create a moat around the data that they collect, that serves as a really effective signaling mechanism to potential private investors who see that kind of moated data as a unique competitive advantage that might differentiate those researchers once they actually hit the market. So there's lots of researchers and there's lots of research in business schools trying to remove some of these, this whole game theory side of this. And to what extent you're seeing that in your domain in researching kind of various cognitive deficiencies that you think you can be resolved, I'm not exactly sure, but I would say that this is a very important issue in business schools that we're trying to tackle. The third point I'll make is also related to this is the commercialization aspect of it. So this isn't so much kind of my remarks or thoughts, but I'm very curious to see what your vision is, Satra, of Do you want to create a full suite of sophisticated apps like Mumble Melody that can improve people's lives? And on top of that, where do you see, do you have an incentive for financial gain out of that? One thing that I will note is that kind of the best technologies and more data doesn't always seem to lead to winners. There's early on in the pandemic, there's a Vancouver-based company that partnered with Eli Lilly called Accelera, and they actually created the very first antibody therapeutic for COVID-19. So this isn't a vaccine, but a drug that you actually take after you get COVID. And they had a very strong AI and machine learning based platform that allowed them to accelerate their wet lab research to try to create this drug. And it's the first drug that got emergency use authorization, but due to their inability to navigate the appropriate regulatory structures, they sort of fell behind. They weren't able to make any money from it. And Pfizer actually with their new therapeutic that they came out with, they actually copied a lot of the work that Eli Lilly did, but they're the ones that actually got all the big contracts, even though they didn't have the best research going into it. So I'm not suggesting that that's going to be an issue for you, but I would just like to bring up that example that the best data and the best research and the best technology doesn't always win out. So I'd love to hear, Satra, kind of where you see this product and how you see it being commercialized.
Excellent question. And Satra, we will get you addressing those comments as being your concluding comments. And we will ask everyone to get on video for the last 30 minutes round table about where do we go from here. Satra, we start with you.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. I think those are excellent points. So I'll start with the first one, which is on this issue of standardization. There is an XKCD cartoon which says, there were 14 competing standards, but they weren't all solving my problem. So I created this 15th one. So now there are 15 competing standards. And I think that kind of speaks to the current culture of standards development. But there's an underlying piece to this, which is knowledge evolution. What we're really talking about is that our understanding of the system and hence our ontology is changing. So what we really need to kind of think about is how to be flexible about creating ontologies if we are going to create one. They're not intended to be set in stone. And I think that's one of the challenges we face because everybody wants to set an ontology in stone while everything about a knowledge system keeps evolving. So if we can kind of get to that point, which is why that next fire evolution came up in your case, it's like, I can't do this. The other part of this is, yes, our AI ML systems are fairly rudimentary at this point in time to do a really good job of knowledge engineering. And I think that technology will improve, but we've kind of said the same thing in the brain context, which is people have been doing mediation technologies to try and align ontologies or database systems or other things together for about 2 decades, and none of them have really worked well enough. So I think on that standardization front, it's like taking a step back and saying, what are we trying to capture and how do we create something that evolves as our understanding of the world evolves? And I think if we can get people to doing that, but I think there are other incentive structures that force people to create standards rather than coming up with a common thing. So I think that's on the standardization front. In terms of commercialization and other things, so I will say Mumble Melody is a technology we are looking to commercialize. But personally, I have several thoughts about it, which is I want to help people and I want to get it into the hands of people as quickly as possible, right? And commercialization and helping, as I've learned over the last year of trying to kind of learn from people who do this, are not at conflict with each other. And in fact, sometimes commercializing can get people more help than not, at least in today's world. I have learned that the world is way more complex than my utopian open access dreams of everything. Would I love to see everything be open and accessible? Absolutely. But I don't control all parts of the planet. And hence, I do see that there are routes to certain things. That doesn't prevent me from talking about the technology, or from thinking that if somebody else comes along and builds it out and puts it out in the hands of people and make money, I'm okay with that. So I'm again talking personally, it's more about that going out there in a way that's effective to people. If that involves us because we have the best know-how of the technology to put it out there, great. If that involves somebody else coming and doing this, there's more to it than just the technology itself. That's the other piece I've learned about commercialization. And there's a reason why these big companies are still selling ads, despite all the ad blockers I use, right? It works on a swath of this planet. And so on that front, it's more about how do we kind of accelerate or shorten the loop, I think is what I would think about, which is in the case of Mumble Melody, the loop is, okay, we've done a pilot study. We have concrete examples. But as we scale up, I don't know, it's like a clinical trial, right? It's similar to that notion of the vaccine development and other things. The second thing I would say on the open front is, why in the world did all publishers decide to open up all COVID-related articles when the pandemic started? I mean, it is contradictory to their natural state of existence. So can I take the utopian thought that if we truly want to accelerate things, open is better than closed? And maybe ask the question that could we change business models around that to say, if we actually opened up everything, and going back to my initial kind of question, at least for today's discussion, which was, what if all the data was instantly accessible? If I extend it out to, what if all information that we produce is instantly accessible? And let's assume for the moment of this conversation, it's standardized and interoperable. Now, I know that's asking a lot, but since we are dreaming, I'm going to conclude with that kind of dreaming process a little bit, which is, if that was the case, we would still have so many barriers to getting from that kind of information space to knowledge space to actual functional space. And I think that may be what the world kind of needs, because it would still require people to do all that work to get it to that functional space. All of that is not going to be limiting in getting to that functional space. So if we can open up, let's open up. So I'm going to stop with that, Laurette.
Great closing comment. That's a pathway to precision convergence. This is just about a bit more pragmatic. How do we get toward this, accounting for the fact that we have 250 years of modern science and society? 30 seconds each, in the same order as the panel, about where do we go from here in terms of advancing all together towards Satra big dream and toward this those convergence collaborative. Let's start with you, Victor.
Thank you. One aspect that was brought up is culture, scientific culture. If all data were available, plus interoperable, all models, we are still missing a new generation of scientists being capable of using this. This requires a culture change in how we operate, and it will take time, but it is a priority and one of the obstacles that we need to take in the short term.
Thank you. Next is Leslie.
Thanks. It's a super interesting discussion. I think we shouldn't underestimate the remaining challenges. In some ways, we've tackled the lower hanging fruit, perhaps, and maybe there does need to be a bit more systematic consideration of what are the next steps, something more strategic, because, you know, granting agencies are requiring open data, but the resources and setups to actually do that are very varying. I would hate for it to turn into sort of a box ticking exercise that's not actually leading us anywhere. I think we should be trying to demonstrate the value of this, not necessarily on all fronts at once, but in specific ways that can show us how to move forward and where the investments make the most sense. Because doing this in a blanket way everywhere as though it were universally good mean, maybe it is, but it's not universally equally good, I don't think. And we should try to focus first on places where we're likely to actually get some yield back again, and that will allow us to get to your utopian dream in the long run.
Thank you. Between Satra and my utopia, we may get there. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks. If there's noise in the background, I apologize. Of course, because my daughter's getting married this week. Also, our water heater broke and flooded. So it's getting replaced as I speak here in my home office. Really enjoyed this discussion, so relevant, and really hope we can find some really substantive threads, concrete threads to follow up on. One that you mentioned that's near and dear to my heart, Satra, was your maybe utopian vision of a common infrastructure or something that could be sustainable that people could build on, and instead of recreating things every time. And maybe even, again, maybe a little bit utopian, but maybe ways that we could leverage this to help bring some of these efforts together and align with, you talked about, or others have mentioned as well, finding these alignments of incentives that we have to be able to make some practical progress on common things, whether it's infrastructure or these standards. So I would love to pursue those threads, with you and with any others who are interested in the context of some of these projects that we're working on.
Thank you, Celia.
Thank you. So a few things come to mind. One of them is that we need creative new kinds of metadata to annotate the different range of actual data that's going to be there. So how do you define it? How do you classify it? How do you make it accessible and visible to other people? In terms of keeping things, moving towards keeping this kind of thing active and alive, it's a question of financial resources too. So if you're going to apply for a grant to create some new data, then you should also be receiving the funding to keep that data accessible and alive and relevant. And that's really a difficult thing to do. So making that easier would go a long way, I think. And I guess my last little point would be lifetime learning. We all have to continue to learn lifetime.
Very good, Andrew, and then Shawn, your closing comment and introducing our next webinar. Andrew.
Yeah, I would just kind of add that from a population health perspective, they have this concept of when you're trying to assess the impact of new technologies, they take the utility delta of the technology and multiply it by the number of people it affects. And they kind of argue that when you're affecting few people, but very significantly, then you can sort of keep it within the academic domain. But when you're affecting lots and lots of people, either a little bit or significantly, that's when you need to involve more industry stakeholders. So it seems the impact of your research kind of spans a lot of people. So I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops and how it integrates kind of, industry leaders and government stakeholders and so on.
Okay, very good. Shawn?
Yeah, this has been a fantastic session. Really appreciate the keynote address, Satra. As always, you came to play. We had the panelists' comments were great. My big thought would be, well, it's not really a big thought, but whenever I talk to people about data standardization and data science, I have come to the realization in working in the neuroscience world, as well as working working with BIDS, that this is way more of a sociological problem than it is a technological problem. I mean, the success of something like BIDS is really more attributed to, when you look at the standard, it's not really that complicated, but it was because there was a community built together around it to make it happen. That's really the key to his success. So these are all good. This is going to be a much bigger sociological problem than it's going to be a technological problem. And so I think we're finally making progress towards that. Although there's a lot of work to do. But thank you again to you, Satra, and all the panelists for the wonderful discussion and commentary. It was great to see some familiar faces again I haven't seen in quite some time. So thank you.
Want to introduce the June 23rd, I believe, Shawn?
June 23rd.
The next with Lauren Ross, I think.
Lauren, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I was looking for I knew it was Lauren, but I blanked on the last name. Yeah, so we'll be having another session on June 23rd. It will be Lauren Ross, and I'm looking for her. I don't know if she's given us a title yet.
Yeah,
but,
it would be about causal mechanism in complexities. It's really a very interesting and important build-up from having had Carl Friston a few weeks ago, having Satra now, and that is advancing our thinking, because this series, as I was saying up front, it's not just a webinar series. It's a capacity building of a world ecosystem of community that find a way to connect in some nimble way both the technology, the human being, and the man-made system that are out there to get real about addressing those challenges, whether it is Alzheimer in an aging population or whether it is sustainability before the planet explodes. Thank you very, very much, Satra. And the other good news also, Satra will be in person at McGill in the fall, invited by Celia. So this is an au revoir, and we will keep working out together. Congratulations again, Phil. Have a great day for the wedding of your daughter. We hope that your house stands still during that time. It's a great event. Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.